So we're going to talk about blacklisting and the media and Donald Trump and where are we going?
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Welcome in. Shanna Pearson Merkowitz, professor at URI Political Science, is back, and she's a sharp mind. We learned from her last week that she's pretty good at this stuff, and we're going to get her perspective on an interesting conversation regarding Donald Trump and, you know, reporters and the First Amendment, and by the time he's done, will there be anybody left who's actually allowed to cover him? And of course, just some campaign discussion as well. It's great to have you aboard. Thank you very much for tuning in to my State of Mind. Let's go to the rundown and take a look at some of the things that are happening tonight. Yeah, revenge porn is a very strange topic. But I guess if you're the victim of it, it's certainly something that's no laughing matter, that is for sure. This bill that Governor Raimondo decided to veto. Sometimes your brain just shuts off. She vetoed this bill, and you know the funny thing is the Attorney General got all honked off about this, and so did the House Speaker. Understand that this bill passed by 68-1 in the House and unanimously in the Senate, because, well, you know, the politics of this are kind of interesting. Look, nobody wants to defend revenge porn. And if you don't know what revenge porn is, gee, what's the matter? Revenge porn is, I don't know, you and your partner were doing something provocative and you posted it, and now you don't like each other anymore, and you post it and you do that to take it out on her. There's a specific case the Attorney General talks about, a website that does just that. But of course, there are more far-reaching possible uses of the law, or actually more, you know, infractions that are possible underneath this concept. What's interesting is that the ACLU and a lot of First Amendment protection organizations urged the governor, despite the momentum coming out of the General Assembly, to veto it. And Steve Brown from the ACLU talked about how hard it is to veto when the General Assembly's got so much momentum.
Most votes in the House and Senate are pretty much lopsided like that. But, you know, you just have to think about the political realities of this. And this is what I give Governor Raimondo a lot of credit for being willing to veto a bill like this. But, you know, how many legislators are going to be willing to vote no on a bill that is labeled, you know, getting at revenge porn? I
mean, the headline, you might think that the governor supports revenge porn. You'd have to be a flaming idiot to think that the governor supports revenge porn, right? So there are all sorts of things the governor was doing there. In fact, she's asking for, and the ACLU and other First Amendment right organizations are asking for, the law to actually duplicate the language that are in other states' laws, which talk about intent. In other words, if you're intending to harm somebody, that's an indicator that you're trying to harm. But if you're a news organization that's using provocative photos, but they're, you know, like Abu Ghraib, for instance, and people are naked, and I mean, all of those things are implicated inside the law. So I think what the governor's looking for, frankly, is the law to be well written and rewritten, and we'll see what happens there. Re-election for Marco. He was adamant. He's either going to be the president or he was going to go into retirement. But guess what? The headline shows you that he's reversed his pledge. Maybe it's because it's in the blood. Maybe it's because, as he says, the Senate now hangs in the balance because the Trump impact is hurting Republicans. He thinks he's got the equity in Florida to be able to make another run successfully. Representative Ron DeSantis is the Republican who has made a lot of waves in the absence of Rubio's track in the U.S. Senate. This is going to be one of the races that everybody watches, and Rubio's back into prime time because it's going to be this razor close, reportedly, in the Senate for, you know, the majority. In the meantime, the guy that impacts the Republicans, or so they say, is Donald Trump. And there's some interesting stuff coming up now in terms of his finances. Now, the other day or yesterday, we were talking about how little he had in his campaign. Now there's some investigative journalism that indicates that he might actually be able to run a scheme to profit off of this campaign. I'm not exactly sure how. It's kind of like one of those mortgage schemes. You have to really investigate it. But between that and the tax return situation, as this headline indicates, there's a lot of financial talk going on. Some from economists on his plan, some from folks who are analyzing his campaign funds, and some from Hillary Clinton, who's like begging for his taxes.
Now it's Donald Trump's turn. Today he'll give a speech attacking his opponent, Hillary Clinton.
Every time she raises money, she's making deals. They're saying, could I be the ambassador to this? Can I do that? Make sure my business is taken care of. I mean, give me a break. All of the money she's raising, that's blood money.
Yesterday, it was Hillary Clinton who blasted Trump, ridiculing his economic plan.
He's written a lot of books about business. They all seem to end at chapter 11. Maybe we shouldn't expect better from someone whose most famous words are, "You're fired."
A report from Moody's Analytics this week seems to back Clinton's claims, estimating Trump's economic proposals would result in 3.5 million fewer jobs. Clinton will continue hitting Trump on the economy during an event today in Raleigh.
You know, interesting, Donald Trump scores high on anti-terrorism, scores high on economics. Hillary actually scores high on commander-in-chief. So there's a lot of folks who are blurring lines, it seems. But if Donald Trump's going to get hit on the economics, he's going to have to go hard on the terrorism thing, and he was yesterday.
ISIS threatens us today because of the decisions Hillary Clinton has made.
You know, there are folks who start to blame Orlando massacres on certain folks. I mean, the senator from Arizona, John McCain, who just can't seem to get out of the game, you know, went after the president specifically, saying it was a direct result of his actions, meaning what happened in Orlando, which is a little bit of a reach. He had to pull that back, but it's kind of too bad, and I think that's the part of what I think citizens in America have such difficulty with. When we have tragedies like this, we end up making them political footballs when lives have been lost and there's a human factor there that all of a sudden seems to be forgotten. But we'll see what kind of movement Donald Trump continues to get on the terrorist thing, because everything else seems to be kind of falling apart right now. It's still early, although it feels late, doesn't it? Does that make any sense? And then is this, which is our conversation today, the freedom to blacklist. Look at these headlines. This is too much. The Post gets revoked, the Washington Post, because they're dishonest and phony. If you're on a media backlist, it's the blacklist, say it 3 times. If you're the Huffington Post, well, it's kind of a red badge of courage, I guess. This is just too much. And this is the number of news organizations right now that have been blacklisted. Our professor from URI is back. Nice to have you.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Are you blacklisted yet?
Not yet. Not yet.
You know, I'm trying to get this show on the list. It seems to be.
We can work on that today.
We can work on that. So that was a lot of stuff. You know, we might end up going backwards a little bit as we go on through the program. But what's your take on this whole media blacklisting thing?
Well, you know, part of it has some historical, you know, connotations that are not that far from normal. You know, there's always been a tendency for, particularly if we look at presidents, not necessarily candidates, but presidents limiting who gets to access them and really limiting it to who do they think will cover them in a positive light. And, you know, you can look back to, you know, Roosevelt, who had an explicit agreement with the press that they wouldn't basically let the public know that he was in a wheelchair. Right. And if there had been a press agency that was going to show that, I think it's very likely he would have blacklisted them from his administration. You know, right now, I find it really fascinating because Trump is really acting much more like the media entertainer he is than a normal candidate. Candidates tend to say, everybody come, be with me, and, you know, get as much press coverage as I can, and he's acting far more like an entertainment person who says, I only want the positive coverage and the rest of you can go. So I think, you know, it's certainly within his rights to decide who gets in the back door, you know, into his private sessions, because he's not limiting, you know, there's been a lot of coverage of the fact that journalists have been using just public access to get into his events. So when they're not given press credentials, they just buy a ticket, right, like everybody else, and they go in.
But the insight comes from being behind the scenes. You know, I liken it. It's very interesting. I often kid sports journalists who really are at the behest of the coaches and the teams that they cover. The coaches and the teams that they cover offer the credentials to get access. And there's just so, and I think most sports journalists would admit this if they're being completely honest, that there is a place where you just, most of them at least, can't go without having their hot dog pass. And I call it the hot dog pass because you get free hot dogs in the back in the press room, where your access gets limited. And I've always kind of thought that it's more freeing to be a normal journalist because you don't have that syndrome. But in campaigns, it almost reverts back to the sports dynamic, which is that the credentials offered to cover the process are offered by the candidate that is being covered. It's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah,
sorry for that long essay, but there's a correlation that I see there.
But I would also say it's very similar to having embedded journalists in the military, right? And those embedded journalists in the military don't have complete free access to write whatever they want. Their credentials are reliant upon them not putting the safety of the squad at risk. And, and some of that is, how do you cover them? And, Trump has really decided, if you look at that blacklist, what you see is these are organizations whose editorial boards have come out against Trump, who have run very negative stories against him, and he has decided that, okay, well, you can cover me from outside. If you want to cover me from inside, you run positive stories.
So there's some of those organizations as we speak. But when you start to get to, all due respect to Politico and even Univision, and frankly, the Des Moines Register is pretty well respected. All those other, the New Hampshire Union leader, who of course went right after him during the primary. If you go down the list, and you're unfamiliar with some of those folks, just Google those organizations because they have become formidable players in this new media world. But when you start to tell the Washington Post they're out,
yeah, it's surprising. The Des Moines Register, I would say, is the same way. They've always been kind of an outsider news organization. They've always played the middle. They've always been a big influence. And when he decided to not give them press credentials, I think that was pretty huge. And, the Washington Post, more of us know the Washington Post, but I would say it's a similar organization, well respected, and huge. And to say that they are, I think what he's thinking is they're extremely left-leaning, which they're not. If you look at their editorial page, right. It's very balanced. But yeah, that's why I say it is very much of Trump as the entertainer, right? I'm going to decide what my news coverage looks like. And, one of the things
producer and director of either his success story or his demise.
Exactly.
We're not exactly sure which it's going to be. We'll talk more about that campaign, and there's another candidate in the race, reportedly. So we'll touch on Hillary Clinton and where she is and where she's going. In the meantime, I just want to let you know that if you're thinking about renovating the kitchen or the bath, this place is the place you ought to choose, as I did. Come to the Kitchen and Bath Design Center, and specifically when it comes to the bath, there are all sorts of creative things that you may want to do in the bathroom, but there's also all sorts of function challenges that you may have. Are there more kids coming? Is everyone bumping into each other? Is there a chance that you can actually have a better organization getting out in the morning? These are the kinds of things that you want to talk to your consultant about, not just the fashion, if you will, but the function. I'll promise you this, though. Whatever project you do will be on time and on budget. We're coming to the Kitchen and Bath Design Center. Back with the professor. Stay with us.
Excuse me, sit down. You weren't called. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Go ahead. No, you don't. You haven't been called. Go back to Univision. Go ahead.
You cannot deport 11 million.
Go ahead.
You cannot deport 11 million people. You cannot build a 1900
Go ahead.
wall. You cannot deny citizenship to children in this
Sit down, please. You weren't called.
I'm a reporter and don't touch me, sir. Don't touch me.
Go.
You cannot touch me. I have the right to ask a question.
Now, of course, that was early in the campaign, but it actually created a tone. That was George Ramos from Univision, who was trying to get on an early campaign press conference. This disposition is what we're talking about. A couple, 3 times at the beginning, so what? But now you got a list. All of a sudden, you look up and you say, "Oh my gosh, I've blacklisted a couple of dozen media organizations." Is it getting out of hand for him? Do you think?
Trump thrives on the more controversial things he does. So, the question I really have here is, do you need to be in the back room to cover Trump? Right? He's saying everything in public that is relevant, to the campaign. I think the people who have been in the back rooms have covered things like fights that are happening between campaign staff, lack of organization, which has been his reason for, getting rid of several news organizations. He's explicitly said this isn't relevant. You know, they say my campaign is disorganized. It's not disorganized. The question is any of that relevant? Is his campaign being disorganized relevant to, you know, really quality news coverage? Or can the Post continue to do quality, and other organizations continue to do quality coverage of the Trump campaign purely based on his public statements and their public access?
When you ask the question, it seems like you have the answer, which is yes. You're asking a question, you're making a point, you know, interrogatively, but it seems to me that you've deducted you more or less can.
I mean, I just think, you know, the people who are responsive to that backroom coverage are the people who've already decided not to vote for him, right? Who's deciding, okay, I'm not persuaded by his statements about terrorism,
Okay.
his statements about this.
All right,
but
so listen, his poll numbers have edged down. He's in a dogfight in Pennsylvania and Ohio where he had like an 8 or 10 point lead. He's 8 points down in Florida, according to the latest poll. So you've got that. He had to throw out his campaign manager and regroup with the Washington guy who makes everybody, at least at the Senate level, feel better. I think he clearly knows that he's at a pivot place, right?
Yes. And that is why I'm surprised he chooses, you know, now to blacklist the Washington Post, right? He's at a pivot point where he needs
some establishment support.
Yeah, and some positive coverage, right? And his route to positive coverage is to limit organizations, which seems very risky as far as I'm concerned, right? I mean, we've had a history of, you know, candidates increasingly deciding to open their doors. Everybody wants to cover me, come in, and that's how you get buy-in, you know, from more and more media establishments. I mean, right now what he seems to be acting like is a Nixon or a Spiro Agnew, who had a very, very adversarial relationship with the press, and see how that worked out for him, right? I mean, when you have that type of adversarial relationship with the press, they investigate more.
Well, the press polls poorly. The press polls poorly. But just because the press polls poorly doesn't mean that you win when you battle with the press and the media.
Exactly, because when I mean, you know, think of it this way: like, what motivation is he giving them to not try to use every back channel they can to dig up his tax records, for example, right? You know, he's not opening the doors and making friends with the press, which is the way that you get the most positive coverage you possibly can. Right? I mean, you want to be friends with the people who are writing stories.
I almost wonder if it's a thing where he says, listen, I don't want to dig too deep, you know, on issues. I don't want to dig too deep, so why don't I just keep as much of this press at arm's length as I can so I don't have to dig too deep?
Well, I think here's the other thing, right? If you grant that type of access, they might be able to hear more and more of the flip-flops, right? So I think Donald Trump has shown that he has a hard time controlling his message. Right? He's here and then he's there within a paragraph.
Right.
And the more direct access the press has to him, the more they're going to be able to cover that. And I think he knows that that is becoming an issue. And, you know, so he may be seeing that, like, maybe he doesn't have the ability to control that, and so he just says, well, then I'll control who has access.
Well, it inures to Hillary's benefit in some ways, because she looks like a walking, talking wonk right now.
Yes.
More picking at Donald's lack of policy structure and specifics than her, you know, setting a new world record for specifics. And I think that seems to be, you know, reflecting in the numbers right now.
Yes, you know, it's interesting because it's the opposite of what we saw with George Bush versus, oh wow, my brain just froze.
George Bush versus... Which George
Al
Bush?
Gore, sorry, where Al Gore was the king of specifics. Here's my plan.
Right.
And the voters didn't like it. Right. They wanted the candidate they could have a beer with.
Right.
Right.
Well, Al Gore talked to everybody like we were morons.
Right.
Right.
But we do seem to see a difference here where maybe, you know, I don't know who wants to have a beer with Donald Trump. They would, you know, probably be yelled at during that beer. You know, so that's not working out so well for him. And so instead they are going towards...
Curiously, though, I think most people would like to spend some private time with this guy. Reportedly, he is a charmer on a one-on-one basis, which is all part of what I think is this narcissistic thing he's got going on.
But that's why it's such an interesting flip-flop, right? Because that's not what we've seen. What we've seen in the past is voters vote for the person who they'd rather have a beer with.
Right.
And who they think are, you know, friendly, they feel like they can identify with. And we're not certainly that's been a negative for Hillary Clinton over the past, her lifetime, is that people don't feel like they can identify with her, that they like her, that they want to sit down with her and hang out with her. But it does seem to be benefiting her now.
When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the numbers, the taxes, the campaign funds, all that. Stay with us.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Oh, maybe that's what I said. This is 14 years ago. They didn't do a retraction.
Again, that's not new, but has set the tone, and that wasn't one of his good ones.
No.
Although I still think that people would like to have a beer with Donald Trump to try to figure out how he really ticks. I don't know who would pay the bill. Right now we got a funny situation going on with the campaign. Can you imagine that Hillary Clinton's got $42 million cash in the bank and he's got less than $2 million, and only 2 days ago he was actually almost running a telethon for himself saying he'd match contributions up to $2 million? Yeah. Whatever happened to the self-funding?
Well,
He reported he could cut the check any time. Is this insecurity about his potential success? Does he really not have the cash? I mean, who knows, right?
Well, I mean, one thing is, there is support that comes with money. So it's not just money, right? When people write a check, they're also writing you their support.
Well, it's a First Amendment exercise.
Mm-hmm. And I think he needs that support, right? He needs that elite signaling. He needs people to bundle those checks to make sure that Wall Street is voting for him. Right? I mean, that's where those checks tend to come from.
Well, I guess it's not happening.
Right. And so I think, this may be an attempt to generate some support or try to gauge even what level of support he has. He certainly doesn't seem to be willing to write himself that check
I really got a minute left. Is the convention going to buoy him? Every convention buoys the candidate for a week's period of time, but the Democrats are behind the Republicans this year on the schedule, so who knows? Does he get a boost that carries him into November, or is this a story that just ends up just listing and he fades out of electoral college oblivion? I don't know.
If I had the crystal ball, I would be on every show.
Right.
But I have a hard time seeing how the Republicans are going to pull off the unification that is required to get that boost, right? What happens at the convention is all the star leaders within the party come out, give their best speeches, all around a uniform policy. And, they get a boost from that. And I have a hard time seeing that they're really going to be able to do that without a really nuanced crafting of their message, which isn't going to go over as easily as when everybody's just having a rally.
Stay tuned, I guess.
Yeah.
I appreciate your insight. Fascinating stuff.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. When we come back, a provocative decision by a worldwide player in the golf world. Stay with us. So Rory McIlroy has decided that he's not going to play in the Olympics. Now, golf in the Olympics is an interesting concept anyway. This is the first time ever, but he's worried about the Zika virus. That's the mosquito-borne virus that's affecting women and pregnancy, and also, and we're going to find out maybe some other things. Between that and the water problem that they have in Brazil, I'm telling you, they're going to have a real hard time celebrating this Olympiad. Stay tuned, because wilder things have happened, and the folks in Brazil don't seem to be quite on top of it. I mean, you can't blame them for mosquitoes, but they got a lot of other problems too. Speaking of golf, earlier this afternoon I had Brad Faxon on of Rhode Island Lore and the Fox Network. If you want to hear that conversation about the controversial aspect of the U.S. Open when it came to Dustin Johnson and his putting rules, go to 630wdpr.com and listen in. We'll see you tomorrow on the radio at 3 and back here. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it.